Tonight on Frontline.
Narcotics trafficking, drug cartel, loan shark, professional con men.
They took my money away.
These are people who prey on the sick and the dying.
Driven by greed.
The offshore scandal. How criminals and scam artists who prey on the innocent hide their stolen profits on tropical islands.
$300 billion
it's
annually.
It's a big problem. The average American
$1 million.
$17 million.
Tonight, from cold cash to hot money on Frontline.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. This is Frontline.
As LA burns, Governor Wilson orders in more National Guardsmen. Since a tremendous fire.
The Los Angeles riots in 1992. Over 1,000 buildings were destroyed. $1 billion lost in property damage.
The entire store has been
And the
ransacked.
damage estimates from all the looting and fires now total at least $200 million.
One group hit particularly hard were Asian American shop owners.
I look at the TV, I didn't even recognize what was that. But it's my friend called, hey, it looks like it's your store, Is that right? Let me see, one more, look at channel 2, and I look at it. It was my store burning down, Oh, God. It was terrible,
Bona Lee and her husband James's grocery store was completely destroyed. They had saved for 25 years to buy the store. In one night, it was gone.
This was all my dream, and it's all gone.
After the fire, Mrs. Lee called her insurance company, but they never paid.
A whole 10, 11 months is passed, we didn't get anything.
Mrs. Lee was not alone. In fact, hundreds of claims by Asian American shop owners were not being paid. Finally, Mrs. Lee decided to seek help and came to the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, where attorney Julie Pack took her case.
A lot of small business owners, especially minorities, don't have the options to go to the well-known insurance companies, the insurance companies that we know about.
Mrs. Lee and 140 other shop owners believe their insurance companies were run by an elaborate web of scam artists who took premiums but had no intention of ever paying claims. Mrs. Lee's $140,000 policy was held by a company that called itself First Assurance and Casualty.
We had people wait 6 to 8 months. The check never showed up. Whenever we called them, they said, call our office in Oklahoma, call our office in Texas, call us in Louisiana.
Mrs. Lee paid nearly $400 in premiums every month, but after the fire, she couldn't find anyone who represented her insurance company.
That's the largest question. What really is the insurance company? Is it one person? Is it 100 people? Does it include a board of directors? Who's accountable? Who is the bottom line? We have no answers to those questions.
To get answers, Pack joined forces with an expensive Los Angeles law firm that had offered free legal services to victims of the riots. Larry Engel was assigned the case.
Mrs. Lee went to the data insurance agency. The data insurance agency bought the policy through Great Republic. The policy was obtained through First Assurance, located in the Caribbean.
Mrs. Lee's company operated out of Oklahoma, Arizona, Texas, and Louisiana, but had been set up offshore, outside the U.S., in the Turks and Caicos Islands.
Earlier in the case, counsel and I really believed that all in the Caribbean, they're just these empty warehouses with answering machines, and nobody works there. Someone comes once a week to pick up the premium checks, and that's it.
They got a lot of money in premiums. They didn't pay very many policyholders, and somewhere offshore there's a big pot of money.
More and more victims of fraud in the U.S. are discovering the source of their problem lies not only in America, but offshore, in small countries and tiny islands where financial regulation is minimal and secrecy is guaranteed. Today, over 60% of the world's money resides offshore, protected from the more rigorous regulation of major financial centers like New York and London. Many of the 50 offshore financial centers worldwide are in the Caribbean, and investigators believe these havens have become essential tools for sophisticated criminals in the United States.
In the United States, if a law enforcement agency has questions, they can come in an investigative process and open up in the United States. In the offshore accounts, you can't do that. There's secrecy. So you have an extraordinary differential in standard that sits as an open invitation, as an incentive for people to say, I'm taking my money away where I can hide it, where I can operate outside of the reach of the law.
The most successful of the offshore centers is the Cayman Islands, nearly 500 miles south of Miami in the Caribbean. Only recently, Grand Cayman was a sleepy sandbar. Today, it is the 5th largest banking center in the world, with over 500 banks. This year, $600 billion will pass through these islands.
When I went to the Caymans for the first time in 1974, there were perhaps 6 or 7 hotels on the beach, and the banking community was beginning to come in. You had 100 banks instead of 520. Now it's wall-to-wall hotel and condo.
Jack Blum is a lawyer and former special counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He learned firsthand about the Caymans while investigating drug money laundering and BCCI, the crooked bank that collapsed.
Offshore centers like the Cayman Islands provide a wide range of people with a black box to hide financial transactions. And that could be drug money. It could be money that is a result of a major financial fraud. It could be money that comes out of some sort of taxable transaction which no one wants tax authorities to get at. The black box is keeping the records, the information, and the data secret.
The Caymans, like several other offshore havens in the Caribbean, are a British dependency, where ultimate authority rests with a governor appointed by Great Britain.
Royal salute! Present!
The annual celebration of the Queen's birthday is an important event here. The Caymans' link to the British Crown is crucial to the island's prosperity.
The Cayman Islands is a place where the British flag is for rent. The British flag symbolizes stability. The British government is really directly responsible for the Cayman Islands. Now, if it were something other than the British government, if it were some independent country, small, subject to diplomatic pressure, the people who deposited in its banks wouldn't feel secure. So, for example, when Panama, which was a premier banking haven, was ruled by Noriega, and Noriega fell out of American grace because of his drug dealing, the hot money was terrified and left immediately.
British offshore centers began to develop in the 1960s as tax havens for wealthy Britons trying to escape the then 80% and 90% tax rates. As the global economy developed, more and more financial institutions began moving offshore, drawn by lower taxes and relaxed regulation. The islands attracted investors by adopting strict confidentiality laws that effectively closed the door to investigators, while technology gave them instant access to major financial markets. But havens designed to avoid the tax collector also had an appeal to organized crime. And during the 1980s, the Caymans and other islands became important financial centers for the drug trade as well.
If it's a British dependent territory, it's basically a magnet for people in the money laundering business.
Go bring it up.
Thank you.
Kenneth Rejock is a former banking attorney from Miami who laundered tens of millions of dollars for cocaine and marijuana smugglers during the 1980s.
I found it obscenely easy. Many of the dependent territories and some of the former British possessions are very user-friendly for money launderers. The beauty of a money laundering tax republic is that you can move money into there and move it out anywhere to the rest of the banking world, thereby disguising its point of origin and its criminal background. I would rent a light twin-engine aircraft in a neighboring island. I would show up at the airfield early in the morning with 5 or 6 clients. Each client would be toting a very substantial briefcase with $1 million or so. For a couple $100, you could get several hours worth of airtime. We would get down there as rapidly as possible. It's about a 2.5-hour trip, enjoying ourselves, drinking champagne on the way down and talking about what we would do.
The DEA finally caught up with Rejok in 1990, and he cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a light sentence. His testimony was frank about how government and banking officials on the islands helped him launder drug money.
As soon as we arrived at the airport, we would have our lawyer, who was then an advisor to Her Majesty's government on that island, talk to the people at customs, because at that time, here we were unloading and presenting no luggage, but a lot of money in a lot of suitcases. The customs people would look at it very briefly, make sure that nobody else saw it, order us to close it up, and pass us right on through without so much as an inquiry as to where was the money going, where did it come from, what was the background, who were we. We would then load up a number of cars, drive right to the bank, lug the baggage up there, and immediately it would be fed into a number of counting machines, because when you have millions of dollars, it takes a long time to count.
In those particular financial institutions that were in the Caribbean, not just Cayman Islands, you had bankers that back in the 70s and 80s were growing those financial institutions, knowing that they were soliciting huge amounts of deposits from at least suspect sources, if they didn't know directly that they were from drug activities or from con men that operated in this country. They certainly knew that these were not Fortune 500 companies that they were soliciting.
The British government has authority over several Caribbean islands. In London, the BBC interviewed the minister responsible, Tony Baldry.
How did we allow offshore islands to be used to the extent that they were, and to a certain extent still are, for drugs, money, and financial crime?
Throughout the whole of the world, throughout the 80s, including the dependent territories, but not just in the dependent territories, you would have found it equally in New York, just as you found it in London. Just as that happened elsewhere, so too it happened in the dependent territories. What is important is the fact that we in the dependent territories have taken the necessary steps, whenever it's been appropriate, to ensure that the regulatory regime becomes tougher, becomes more refined, to deal with any perceived and real weakness within the system.
But those reforms came only under extreme pressure from the United States.
During the course of these negotiations, I was told that Margaret Thatcher called Ronald Reagan to complain that the United States was being far too tough and that we were beating up on the British negotiators who were handling this, and that we shouldn't be so tough because we would ruin the economy of the island.
In 1990, the islands finally ratified a treaty which granted U.S. investigators limited access to banking details if they could prove a bank account's connection to criminal activity.
Well, what happened was the most egregious things were in fact closed down. So people do not now arrive, for the most part, from the United States with suitcases loaded with currency. We don't have charter flights with carloads of currency from the United States going into Cayman Islands banks. That was taken care of.
But the treaty allowed no fishing expeditions by U.S. investigators, and the island's confidentiality laws remained in place. It is still a crime in the Caymans for anyone to divulge financial information.
What they've done is they've curbed to a great degree the inflow of cash. What they have not curbed is the use of the legal system in those islands, the anonymous corporations, the various other ways of hiding the cash that moves from one bank to another bank so that the police can't follow it. And their facilities and that kind of corporate structure are absolutely essential to criminal activity in the United States.
So in fact, have they helped us?
What they've done is they've helped us a little bit, but the little bit isn't enough, and more has to happen.
To demonstrate the kind of services offered routinely by some banks in the Caymans, which enable American citizens to flaunt U.S. financial laws, we asked Jack Blum to secretly record a sales pitch from the Guardian Bank and Trust Limited in Grand Cayman. He talked with its president, John Mathewson.
Let me begin by asking a little bit about banking confidentiality. How real is it?
It's very real, and you have no problems at all. Your confidentiality here in the Cayman Islands will cover you completely.
Mathewson explained how Guardian could set up an anonymous corporation to disguise Blum's banking transactions to make them untraceable.
We are able to serve as nominee directors so that if something has to be signed or executed on your instruction, we can do it for you. With this mechanism, you can operate any place in the world without anyone being able to ascertain that you have anything to do with that corporation at all.
I was told 10 different ways to avoid U.S. tax, to take profits from my business out of the United States, set them up offshore, and then lend them back to my business, and then charge them as a further expense, charge the interest payments as a further expense on my business. In fact, legitimize moving more money offshore.
Mathewson told Blum how to secretly get his money out of the United States and into the Caymans.
Keep your checks under $10,000. We will give you the name of 3 different corporations that we keep for this purpose. We always want odd numbers. After you've made it out, you wrap it in a sheet of plain paper. Put your account number on the paper, not on the check. Send it to us by regular airmail. Upon receipt, we credit your account. We then courier that check back along with hundreds of other checks to one of our correspondent banks in the U.S. where it's cashed. And when it comes back to you, if you flip it over, all you see in the back is a U.S. bank. Absolutely no way that anyone can ascertain that check was offshore. We've done our homework. Wow. We know what to do and how to do it.
And Mathewson told Blum how he could spend his offshore funds secretly in the United States.
One of the simple ways is we issue gold credit cards as you wish. For the first time in your life, you'll be able to charge something on a credit card where only you and this bank will know what has been charged.
Another Cayman's bank, Finsbury Bank and Trust, also issued gold MasterCards which guaranteed confidentiality. They were used in United States cash machines to apparently launder criminal money. One Finsbury client used his card extensively.
It would amount to several $1,000s a day, and in the space of less than 2 years, he managed to withdraw over $1 million out of his account down here. We've seen no explanation on file. We cannot think of any good reason why he would necessarily need to have cash.
Why would someone use a method like that in order to withdraw several $1,000s a day?
I can only conclude that he's doing something which is illegal.
After an FBI investigation discovered how the cards were being used, the bank was closed down. But as we discovered at Guardian Bank, secrecy is still being sold in the Caymans.
We know that it will take a year or 2 before you're really comfortable offshore. Once you're comfortable, you probably wish the hell you'd done this 10 years ago.
And all of this was done without even figuring out who I was, or what I was trying to do. And of course, in the conversation, I should say, there was a kind of gratuitous reference to, well, we don't do business with drug dealers. But He didn't ask whether I was involved in fraud, and it's clear that everything he suggested that I do violated some portion of U.S. law.
Today, U.S. authorities are not just worried about drug money, but their ability to follow any financial paper trail when it runs offshore. This is illustrated by a case in which dozens of American and British citizens lost millions, as reported by BBC correspondent Gavin Hewitt.
Last year, a young entrepreneur from England set out to raise venture capital in America. Najim Kidwai had failed to raise funds in Britain and turned instead to a company in Florida. Like many others who chose this route, he would end up losing money.
We saw an advert in the Sunday Times, approached a company called Turnberry Underwriters Limited, who were based in Miami. We were picked up in a limousine, which was sent by Turnberry. Very impressive, very much like Miami Vice. The chauffeur had asked, did I like Indian music? And I said yes, so he played. Just very comfortable environment.
Najim Kidwai was looking for funding to finance a virtual reality project intended for medical research. Turnberry offered him a deal. They would provide $8 million in collateral for a bank loan in return for a fee of $100,000. However, the collateral would only be available if Najim Kidwai arranged a letter of credit to cover 20% of the deal. That $1.6 million would be Turnberry's payment for securing the loan. If he failed to raise a letter of credit within 30 days, he would forfeit his $100,000 fee. Unknown to Najim Kidwai, one of the men he had dealt with at Turnberry was under investigation for alleged fraud. Les Mirsky denied that the contracts were drawn up in such a way that almost every potential client forfeited his fee. However, Turnberry and related companies are estimated to have collected $30 million in fees from those who failed to meet the deadline, and the FBI is investigating. Mr. Mirsky, who denied he had negotiated with Najim Kidwai, was unsympathetic to his plight.
Have you seen his contract? I don't mean to...
Yes, I have seen his contract.
Okay, and was it signed by me?
His contract wasn't signed by you, but you were the person he negotiated with.
That's not true.
Well, it is true, because he sat in this very office that we're in now and met with you.
Absolutely. He came through an agent in New York, and he went to another office in Florida first, and then found his way here. Ultimately, I had a conversation with him. Ultimately, he signed a contract. Ultimately, he failed. Since then, he's a psycho-lunatic running all over the world, intriguing, I guess, to investigative journalists who like to print this stuff. Okay. However, it's just not true.
But after his initial meeting at Turnberry, Najim Kidwai was delighted. He thought he had the money to finance the project. He did not realize that most banks would not issue a letter of credit for the 20% he was to raise, unless they had evidence that Turnberry's $8 million collateral existed. He was to approach over 200 banks. All the time, his 30 days were passing, and he risked losing the $100,000. Eventually, one bank in London showed interest, but they needed to approach the banker for Turnberry. It turned out to be in the Cayman Islands.
The bank that was involved was a bank called Guardian Bank and Trust Grand Cayman Limited, and our bank approached this bank and found out very quickly that they were not getting sufficient banking information that was required to conclude this transaction. This led our bankers to believe that there was a problem here, and it may be a scam of some type.
Guardian Bank did tell Kidwai's bank orally that the funds for the collateral existed, but the London bank wanted further information, including where the money came from.
Mr. Mathewson, from BBC television.
When Guardian's president, John Mathewson, declined to provide more information, the London bank pulled out. The deal fell through, and Kidwai lost his $100,000 fee.
Are you not the banking reference for Turnberry's?
Absolutely not.
We have details that Turnberry's used your bank.
That is not correct.
We've seen the details.
You really ought to check your
No.
information first.
We've seen the accounts where Turnberry have used your bank, and they have actually cited you as their referee.
I would suggest that you research this much better because I have no knowledge of what you're talking about.
Are you saying that you don't know anything about Turnberry?
But the BBC has learned of a report turned over to the Cayman authorities by a former executive of Guardian Bank, which confirmed Mathewson's link to Turnberry and cited 5 or 6 other suspicious cases being run through the bank.
There have been many victims. They cite your bank as being the banking referee.
I'm very sorry.
Mathewson is an American citizen who founded Guardian in 1985. In the past year, his position at the bank was changed following an investigation by the Cayman authorities, who say they have taken action, but will not reveal what it is.
What comfort can you give those people who have lost money?
The comfort that I can give, I'm not sure if I can give
because
comfort.
Because the individual concerned is still in place, he's still running a bank.
That is not entirely correct. Okay.
In what way is it incorrect?
It's incorrect in that individual is not in the same position as he was at that point.
He still turns up to his bank.
There are checks and balances in place as part of a revised internal control system.
The Cayman authorities are satisfied with the action they have taken. John Mathewson is currently under investigation by state and federal authorities in the United States, and the dozens of entrepreneurs who lost money are still seeking an explanation for the offshore connection.
It's happening to so many people, and on such a large scale, I think the average American would be shocked. I've handled a number of cases like that, and it's gotten to the point where I just hear the beginning of the story and I say, "You've been had," and the people say, "How do you know that?" And it's because I've heard the story 5 times before.
There is even more concern with another offshore center, the British Virgin Islands. In the 1980s, these islands too aggressively began to sell financial secrecy. With the approval of the British government, they adopted legislation enabling international business companies to be formed, companies in which it would be impossible to discover who the real owner was.
Why would people go there? What is it about it that makes it so attractive?
It's the fact that the incorporation laws in those islands allow you to set up corporations, and oftentimes to do so without divulging either to the individuals in that government who the beneficial owner is, or because of the secrecy laws there, prevent U.S. law enforcement or regulators from being able to determine in those cases where they are conducting either an investigation or a civil inquiry who it is that is the owner behind those corporations.
So they really are hideaways?
Yes.
These hideaways proved attractive to lawyers acting as fronts for criminal groups, and they headed for the capital of the British Virgin Islands, Road Town, on the island of Tortola.
I would take a taxi real fast into Road Town, see somebody that I knew, form a corporation, and get the heck out of there as quickly as possible. Do it all within an hour or 2. Take that corporate identity, the name. Of course, it was a company that was on the shelf, meaning was already formed by that attorney or accountant and just waiting for a buyer. I would take that name back to the United States, give it to a client who would use it for his own nefarious purpose.
Did you regard that as easy?
I regarded it as easier than brushing your teeth.
An accountant on Tortola also found these international business companies very useful. Sean Murphy would launder over $300 million through them. In his files, he kept ready-made companies that could be set up within hours and sold off just as quickly. If the client wished to disguise the ownership of a company, Murphy would provide substitute nominee shareholders. Dealing usually with American lawyers, the accountant often never knew who his real clients were. When he was arrested, Sean Murphy chose to cooperate with investigators in exchange for his freedom. His testimony unraveled an international drug smuggling and money laundering operation and gave investigators an invaluable roadmap for how criminal enterprises used the British Islands to launder money. Although Murphy still will not appear on camera, for the first time, he talked with us about the service he provided the visiting lawyers.
I met him on board the boat and we just socialised, and he informed me that he wished me to form some companies for him. He would choose the name of the company. He would then ask me invariably to provide full nominee services for the company. So I would appear to be the owner of the company.
Murphy says this particular client, a successful Miami lawyer, wanted him to wire money between offshore centers, further disguising the paper trail.
I would open a bank account at Barclays Bank with myself as signatory, and he'd give me instructions about monies being wired in and how I was to deal with them. Afterwards, we met for lunch at Wickham's Quay. He gave me standing instructions upon receipt of funds to wire them onwards to a bank he gave me in California. Eventually, about $4 million was wired through the Virgin Islands. The governments of the island know very little about who is using the companies. They'll obviously appreciate the income that is generated. They have no control over what clients a trust company will take. And there's no register of who the clients are. There is no way for the government of these islands to find out who the trust companies are dealing with. Because, of course, the trust companies are offering secrecy. If there was a way of finding out, they wouldn't use that jurisdiction.
Despite the evidence provided by Sean Murphy of how these international business companies were being used by criminals, the number of company registrations has risen dramatically. In the British Virgin Islands alone, from 5,000 in the mid-'80s to over 120,000 today.
What do you think it is that attracts people to forming companies here?
I think you'll find in the BVI there is a friendliness which you may not find elsewhere. And people like to know where they're doing business, that there's a friendly emotion with the people who live in the country and where they want to do business. And I think this has...
Hamilton Laverty Stout is the Chief Minister for the British Virgin Islands, with overall responsibility for regulating the financial center. We asked him how these international companies can be properly controlled if only people who set up companies like Sean Murphy know who the real owners are.
It will not just left to them, it also will be the duty of the bank and trust company inspector and regulator to be able to dwell into the situation to know exactly who they're dealing with.
Well, let me ask you another question. Why the need for secrecy?
Excuse me, go ahead here. You get into some technical...
The question of secrecy and how you can ensure proper regulation is surely a proper question for you as Chief Minister.
Well, the thing about it is I must take strong objection. The reason why I asked you to put questions on paper, what you want to ask me, is the reason why I will not answer that question, because it was not one of the questions you put on paper, and I am very serious when it comes to that. I only will answer any question.
No. It's not an unreasonable question,
well,
is it?
It may not be an unreasonable question to you, but I am saying I will not answer that question because it was not on the list of questions which you asked me.
American investigators are increasingly concerned with the connection between these anonymous offshore companies and the growing problem of insurance fraud in the U.S., which has become a billion-dollar-a-year racket.
One factor in the high cost of health care is outright fraud. And federal prosecutors have now charged officers of a now-defunct insurance company based in Denver with the...
In 1992, federal authorities broke up a huge insurance scam headquartered in Denver. The company, Cabot Day, was responsible for thousands of health insurance policies in the U.S. But when it came time to pay the claims, there was no money.
In this one case, there were 14 states involved and 11,000 policyholders. And this case didn't last very long in the sense of insurance coverage. This was approximately 13 months existence of this company. In that amount of time, They had taken in approximately $5.6 million in premiums, and they left abandoned approximately $5.7 million in unpaid claims.
When Cabot Day began selling insurance, it registered its company offshore in the British Virgin Islands and claimed it had millions of dollars in assets. Because of the minimal regulation governing these offshore corporations, U.S. insurance regulators were not aware if those assets really existed.
They presented a financial statement which showed they had $10 million in assets. It all looked legitimate, but they were made-up numbers. They were absolutely lies, each and every one of them.
One of the insurance con men described for us the ease of setting up anonymous companies in the islands.
Basically, we called it one-stop shopping. You would go into the islands and we could form the company, be licensed, and be able to write business all in the same day. So.
And what checks did the islands make on you?
Basically this, that we paid our registration fee.
And beyond that?
That was it.
And on the basis of what you had set up in those islands, you were then able to sell insurance in the United States on a basis which was totally fraudulent.
That's correct. Our asset base was just not there.
In New Jersey, Lloyd Arazi was facing huge medical bills as his wife lay hospitalized with cancer. Unknown to him, his health insurance company had been taken over by Cabot Day, and when he turned to them to pay for his wife's treatment, there was no money.
Mercifully, she died. Mercifully, she died because I was praying for her to die because she was in such a terrible state health-wise, and she was really suffering badly. But mercifully also that I wouldn't have to go through any more of this financial burden, because in a matter of a few months, not a year, but in a matter of a few months, I would have been wiped out completely. She mentioned that over and over again, that this is costing you so much money, this is costing us so much money, you're going to lose the house because I'm sick. I want to die, and I want to die now. They're utter ghouls. These are people who prey on the sick and the dying, the worst people on earth, as far as I'm concerned.
Minister, in the 80s, there were some well-publicized cases where these international business companies were behind serious financial crime. How has it come about that those number of companies, which was 5,000, I think, during the mid-80s, has risen to 120,000, when it was quite evident that if you set up companies where you can't discover who the real owner is, they will be used by criminals?
No, the concern is not with the concept of an international business company. The concern is ensuring that regulators and law enforcement agencies can find out and can discover who are the true owners of the funds concerned.
And they can't with the international business companies.
Quite proper issue. And it's for that reason that the dependent territories are amending their legislation so that can come about. And that seems to me to be wholly proper, quite right. They have perceived a perfectly legitimate need, which they are responding to through their regulatory regime.
The changes proposed by the British government would help investigators discover the real owners of these companies. But even if the measures are approved, they still fall far short of the standard in New York or London of openly identifying the owners of corporations.
It is pathetic. Fundamentally, these folks who are involved in these networks are running circles around the capacity of law enforcement. It's almost as if you had 21st century technology being applied to the criminal enterprise and 19th century law enforcement capacity trying to stop it. And law enforcement is regrettably so far behind that it's going to take a major international cooperative effort to change the process.
I will
discharge
all the duties.
But there are some signs of progress in the fight against offshore financial crime.
According to law. So help me God.
So help me God.
This year, investigators from Scotland Yard and the FBI formed a new task force to counter white-collar crime in the British dependent territories.
documents here that I think we ought to review.
Having the ability to tap into British law enforcement who might have intelligence about many of these scam artists and who also have a much more in-depth knowledge of the laws and the operation of these companies in these offshore venues, I think that it makes us that much more effective. I think nationwide we've now convicted something like 200 individuals in a variety of insurance fraud, con man schemes, offshore banking, money laundering, and some of the results have been extremely impressive.
They're starting down a road, and I think the law enforcement people involved in it are well-intentioned. The problem is you can't solve this with law enforcement people. You have to go after the system. It's the system that's no good. It's the system that has to be changed.
For all of the concern about money laundering and fraud, in Washington they're worried about something even bigger: the billions of dollars lost in taxes. The Internal Revenue Service estimates $300 billion ends up offshore each year as part of tax evasion schemes. Jerry Rowe heads the IRS criminal division that looks into tax fraud.
Tell me how a basic scam might work.
Well, if you want to take as a case example, let's look at a case in New England that involved an owner of a dairy store there.
Howdy, partners! Welcome to Stu Leonard's Country Hoedown Show.
Stu Leonard's dairy store was Connecticut's biggest tourist attraction. Part supermarket, part theme park, it was a marketing miracle. Catchy gimmicks lured customers and their children.
I hear you, OJ.
Its owner, Stu Leonard, was given an award for entrepreneurial excellence by President Reagan.
Hear the farm fresh by. How do you do?
When they come in here, I have this concept that they're right, and I want to please them because they're going to come back. And our whole policy here is to make a lifetime customer.
The store was making millions of dollars every year. Then in 1991, customs agents searched a passenger about to board a flight to St. Martin in the Caribbean. The authorities discovered the passenger had altered a currency report and was secretly trying to take $70,000 in cash out of the country. The passenger was Stu Leonard. It was the beginning of the end for Leonard. The IRS and the United States Attorney's Office started to dig into his taxes.
We know that they skimmed over $17 million in cash. And we estimate, for the purpose of the case at least, that approximately $6.7 million in taxes was lost to the government while they were conducting this.
For 10 years, Leonard and his accomplices used a sophisticated computer program to underreport the amount of money the dairy store was making and then smuggled the skimmed cash offshore.
Amounts went at one time from $10,000 up to $250,000. They were taken out of the country on numerous occasions, taken on their persons, taken in briefcases, taken in suitcases. Even on some occasions they were taken inside gifts or what appeared to be gifts, baby gifts, other kinds of gifts.
Once the money got to French St. Martin, it quickly became untraceable.
We do know that they were taking out large sums of cash repeatedly. We also know that they had extensive holdings in St. Martin. Mr. Leonard built a palatial estate in St. Martin called Carpe Diem. He built 4 condos, apartments for his children. So we know that he's invested a lot in the St. Martin economy.
Investigators still don't know exactly how much cash Leonard took to St. Martin.
There really is no way that we have now to trace a bank transaction in St. Martin like we do here in the United States.
We can run into difficulty, and not because a country is unwilling to cooperate, but if certain laws prohibit the disclosure of certain financial information, we also have no legal authority to compel witnesses or to compel documents to be produced in a foreign country.
as a matter of general rule.
Stu Leonard was sentenced to prison and ordered to pay a multi-million-dollar fine.
Well, I made a mistake. I'm very sorry. I have just acknowledged that mistake in court, and I'm prepared to take the consequences.
Leonard's conviction was the end of the largest computer tax fraud in American history.
Is this the tip of the iceberg?
I guess a lot of times you just don't know what you don't know. But it's our environment, our economic environment is one that lends itself to these type cases. We have people that have cash businesses, whether it's a grocery store or a restaurant or a bar. Cash is generated and can be smuggled outside of the country.
For law enforcement agencies, chasing illegal tax evaders like Leonard offshore is one problem. But billions of tax dollars are also moving offshore legally through elaborate loopholes. Offshore financial advisors offer a full range of services, from hiding money in case of divorce to helping doctors worried about malpractice suits.
Certainly the medical field is a fertile ground for this area. But any businessman that's in what we'll call a high-risk industry, I would say a real estate developer for one, would need something like this.
More and more Americans worried about lawsuits and taxes are moving their money into offshore trusts where it can be protected by the secrecy laws.
It's possible for me to make a call to Utah and set up a limited liability company that same day, to call the Bahamas and set up an international business company that same day, and to call the Isle of Man and get a trustee. And I actually have floppy disks of various trust instruments from different trustees throughout the world. So you can move very fast. In return for protecting the money, you have given up the control of the money. But that doesn't mean you can't get the benefits of the money. For example, you can lease a Rolls Royce. It's not yours, but you can drive it and enjoy it. You could lease a chalet and enjoy it. It's not yours.
So what's wrong with that?
The tax base is walking. What's wrong with it is people have the capacity to opt out, and more of them have the capacity and are doing it. And one morning we're going to wake up and there's nobody here who's going to pay taxes. That isn't going to work.
But shouldn't we all pay our fair share?
We are paying it. I can't suggest that one not take the benefits of various tax advantages or tax loopholes, if you prefer, that exist that reduce the taxes you pay. Now, who is to say it's unfair if one takes advantage of a tax loophole that's there? Those loopholes are known to our legislators rather. They know they're there. If they want to fix them, they should fix them. But your CPA will advise you to use them until they're fixed.
Reaction to that, Senator?
Well, it's a total scam, obviously. I mean, it's absolutely artificial. It is established solely for the purpose of avoiding the law here in the United States. And if enough people go off and do that, you're going to have a revolution in this country when the average taxpayer or citizen sits there and says, hey, wait a minute, folks. If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. And if you guys don't clamp down on that, I'm not going to pay my taxes while this doctor or this lawyer or this person is out there, skimming for nothing. So we're going to have to face the reality of this challenge.
Earlier this year, when Queen Elizabeth visited the Cayman Islands, she knighted the man who had been instrumental in setting up this wildly successful financial center 30 years ago. For these islands, offshore finance has been the key to a new prosperity. But the United States still sees them as havens for white-collar criminals. There have been changes in the right direction, but they have not solved the problem.
If you were sitting across from Bill Clinton, you could make something happen about this, what would you say?
I'd say go hard first at the British. because it's their tax havens which are the serious ones. People count on the stability of the British government and the British Foreign Service to protect the secrecy. I think we have to go head to head and make them shut it down.
But the British government believes it has already taken the necessary steps.
No one wishes to, no honest person wishes to deposit their money in a financial market with which they have concerns. And so there is every incentive for the Cayman Islands, for all the other dependent territories, of ensuring that the world's financial markets have confidence in their probity and in their integrity, and that is why they have every incentive in eliminating bad clients and bad money.
And in Washington, there is little talk of taking a tougher stand on the offshore financial centers.
Do you believe that there is the political will or even the interest in attacking this problem in Washington?
I think if the average American understood what is at stake here, if people understood that there are bankers who sit in various places like the Cayman Islands and tell you you are a fool if you pay United States taxes, I think if people understood how much money was involved, how much criminal activity was involved, there would be the political will in a flash. The question really is, how can we tolerate their doing it and making a living by allowing people to evade our laws? I don't think we'd do that if there were a pirate ship cruising around and hitting various ports in the United States, and this is the functional equivalent, the 21st century pirate ship.
Dear Frontline, I'm so...
And now it's time for your letters. School colors, Frontline's report last week on Berkeley High School, inspired a wide range of reactions.
Dear Frontline, I was deeply disturbed upon watching the Frontline broadcast on Berkeley High School, my alma mater. While race and racism were issues before, I don't remember the same fever pitch of fear, rage, blame, and free-floating hostility.
I was aghast to see teachers at Berkeley High promoting racial separatism, hatred, and historical revision.
Berkeley High School is a bureaucratic funny farm with a sense of mission only peripherally, including education. I pity these kids.
Students who squander their precious few years of education on meaningless debate over racial issues are the most unfortunate actors in this stage.
The young people at Berkeley do a better job of dealing with racism than do the rest of us. They actively participate in a healthy exchange and share their concerns. It's time for all of us to do the same.
Students at Berkeley High gave this reaction.
Berkeley High has so many different faces and so many different aspects of it, and they chose this one little sensationalist whatever slice of it.
There was a great amount of rich culture that was shared among the students, and that wasn't presented.
It wasn't a lie, but it was a sin of omission, and in that way, it was a partial lie.
Elizabeth Schur, the parent of a Berkeley High School student, sent a video letter.
Dear Frontline, for the past 8 years, I have had children attending Berkeley High School, so I am well aware of the problems there. With all the racial problems at Berkeley High School, there are several important integrated successes, none of which were mentioned on the program. What was the message of school colors? It certainly was not clear, and it certainly was not a balanced view. Is there no hope for integrated public education? Should we return to segregation? Berkeley High School deserved better. Sincerely, Elizabeth Schur.
Interact with Frontline. Send your comments by fax to 617-254-0243, by letter or home video to this address. It was corporate hardball.
Company was growing, no internal controls, no rules and restrictions.
That got out of hand.
Fooled the auditors.
Massive accounting fraud.
Sinking deeper and deeper and deeper.
Cooked the books.
How to steal $500 million on Frontline.
There have been many victims. They cite your bank as being the banking referee.
Very sorry, we have nothing to do with it at all.
We have details of it.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. For videocassette information about this program, please call this toll-free number, 1-800-328-PBS1.
This is PBS.